This red is the red I want. All right. Thanks for sticking around for the last session, everyone. This is Twig and Fractal in Drupal, decoupling UI components from Drupal data structures.
The red button. Did you press the red button?
I did press a red button. It's.
Yeah, you're good.
I'm good? Okay. My name's Chris. I'm a senior dev at Bluecadet. I sort of work more in the front-end dev world. I've been dipping my toes into Drupal lately. So this talk has a variety of titles, and the industry, I think, is a little bit confused about what we want to call some of these techniques we're using. Sometimes they're style guides, sometimes they're component libraries, sometimes they're UI components. I've seen pattern libraries, I've seen design systems. But we're talking about building sort of systems that we will throw Drupal data into. Bluecadet, just a quick little background. You might have seen this. We've been doing a few talks today. We talk about doing work across space and screen. We do installation work. We do sort of more experiential web work and JavaScript apps. And we do some bigger CMS-driven, this is WHYY, Drupal sites, WordPress sites. I've been spending the last couple of years in more JS app land, but the last 6 months have been sort of Drupal experience. We've been doing some projects around this topic before we really jumped in. One of those, my coworkers Sean and Ryan over there worked on swarthmore.edu, which was a project for a university that had an internal Drupal team, and we were hired to design and build like a static design system. They use Fabricator, which lets you spit out a sort of nice looking board of components. These were then, we're not exactly sure what they did in the implementation phase. I'm pretty sure they would have referenced, markup examples from this board, pulled them into Drupal templates, and built out this lovely website that doesn't play when you go back to it. Sean sort of took us on a deep dive into the IP CSS architecture. I don't know if is that something people are familiar with? Have you ever heard of? No. Okay, cool. We'll get there. We also have experienced, sort of played with completely decoupled Drupal architectures. This is a Drupal backend and a Gatsby JS front end. Putra worked. I worked on this with Putra. Bluecadet is a little bit known for sort of a lot of UI polish and animation, and separating out the sort of focusing just on the React app lets us sort of do that in a more free-form way, I would say. Up until this project, we had sort of been dabbling with React. We often were using a sort of separate SaaS build process that would get sort of just plopped on top of our React app. This site, we tried out the idea of CSS modules. They're a little bit funky, but they sort of were an interesting experiment. CSS module is a CSS file in which all class names and animation names are scoped locally by default. Oddly enough, this is sort of the topic I want to talk about for a minute. At the moment, at least my Twitter feed is a little bit tuned to, for some reason, arguments about CSS and if CSS and in JS should even be a thing, should it be used, is it the best thing in the world? I have mixed feelings, but CSS modules let us sort of play with some of these ideas, but we still write CSS in CSS files, which is nice. honestly, any issue related to CSS seems like it can end up in some heated tempers and arguments and such. So that's going to be a theme throughout some of this talk. So back to CSS modules. Is that, what's colors? Yeah, they're legible. CSS modules, it's a CSS file that gets imported into a JavaScript file and sort of transpiled to make it so your class names will automatically never conflict with each other. That's a bit of a mouthful, and it's sort of like a sledgehammer approach to doing a BEM sort of namespacing that you don't have to look at, and everything just works out for you. What's happening under the hood is in your JavaScript file. I know this is like a little in the weeds, but we'll get to why this makes sense. You're importing a CSS file. You end up with a JavaScript object with keys that then give you a string of some transpiled class name that's not going to conflict with anything. And then you can access those class names from the object. This is sort of like a React JSX component. And the great part about this is both of these components are using a class called isWrite, and there would be no conflict on these because you have these transpiled classes. When I access style.isRipe in avocado, it's going to make it black, and when I do it in banana, it's going to make it yellow. This process, it's a little, some people would say, oh, you're sort of killing the CSS cascade. I don't disagree. But it lets you write super focused component-based CSS without really thinking about it. And it also forces you to. So you cannot, back in this example, if I'm in banana.js, I cannot style any child of banana.js. It sort of prevents that notion of, well, this is a good example. Let's say I have an alert, and maybe I have a button in it. This is still sort of JSX-y looking code, which we'll just pretend is HTML that works at the moment. Say you have an alert. Say it has something that's maybe your sort of a UI button you're using. You might write some CSS that makes that button red from the sort of CSS that's grouped around the alert. With CSS modules, this is just impossible. You can't do it. And instead, you have to sort of design your button component to take some data that says that I want the red version of this button, or I want the alert version, or I want the whatever it is. You've given this button a sort of a look that it knows what that means and can apply that to itself. This is sort of on its own, it's not a very mind-blowing difference, but it sort of alludes to an agreement between these components about how they're going to know about each other. So an alert knows that it has a lot of different variations of a button it can use. The button knows that it is providing this idea of styles that the alert can use, and disagreement is impossible. This workflow makes it so multiple developers can work on the same code base without breaking each other's stuff. Oftentimes people will say the solution to sort of multi-dev collaboration is just having more conversations and planning, and that's all true, but this idea that we can design our systems and tools to help us not break each other's code and sort of force agreement is an idea to keep in mind as we look at, we're going to step outside this, but we're going to keep this in mind as we're looking at Drupal and templates and UI components more in a traditional SaaS world. So back to Drupal, we had kind of been doing this, we did the static style guide, we did this fully decoupled CSS module thing. As a front-end dev, I was pretty happy. I didn't have to touch Drupal ever, which felt great. We also, this idea of, I'm at Bluecadet, we're an agency, we're building things for often an internal tech team or maybe somewhere with only one developer. These JavaScript libraries are like super young and change a lot and are like fun and interesting, but not always the most maintainable or take a lot of attention to keep up with. It's not always the best deliverable as an agency. But we're kind of looking for inspiration from what some of these tools can do and how we can build those into our more traditional workflow. Additionally, I was kind of coming off of that Gatsby project. I was going into this suite of 4 websites that are quite large. They all use a similar design system, but they all can be kind of color themed in different ways. There's a whole slew of additional sort of UI treatments throughout these sites. And we're kind of interested in how can we build the most sort of foolproof, reusable system that can be used across all these websites. So there was a lot of sort of research and reading and learning about Drupal, to be honest, that went into sort of designing the system. I arrived at a sort of workflow that seems pretty good. We're going to look at Twig in Fractal in Drupal. So what is Fractal? Is anyone familiar with Fractal? Seen it? Got one? Yeah, Bettina. Fractal, these are just quotes from the docs. It's a powerful component libraries and style guides that fit the way you work. It's a tool to help you build and document web component libraries and then integrate them into your projects. Out of the box, it uses handlebars, but it can be modified to use basically any templating language you want. If you're into sort of noodling around on your computer while I'm talking, these are some nice examples online of just people that have built nice displays of their sort of web patterns. They're available online. They're great. A little shout out to, or big shout out, I guess, to Rachel Andrew, who does all sorts of great writing around CSS. She has this article, Pattern Library First, an approach to managing CSS. This is one of the better, I learned earlier this morning that you can't see links at the bottom of the screen from up there. But if you search her name and Pattern Library for CSS, she's got a great walkthrough of what is Fractal, setting it up. It doesn't come with its own gulp process, so she's got a nice little workflow for doing all of that. And in her article, she discusses the idea of a pattern library and its implementation not drifting away from production code on the website. That's the sort of crux of what we're trying to solve, is no matter what system we're using, if the actual components aren't in production code, you're ultimately going to end up with these two separate things that won't agree with each other anymore. And yeah, check out her gulp setup. It's super easy. So if you've checked out the links, this is what Fractal looks like. In addition to their sort of floofy definitions, it's a node-based sort of local dev environment that you can view your UI components in whatever template language they might be. It can also be built statically and published online for reference. It has this notion of, if you see here, there's on the left, it'll like lay out all your components you've defined. You have this sort of tabbed interface down at the bottom that will, you can click to the HTML it's spitting out. The view is the sort of template, whether it's Twig or handlebars or whatever. Context is a sort of Fractal proper noun. It's the data you're going to define for Fractal to generate, like programmatically generate your components. It has this notion of variance. So under full width callout, we have default, themed, blah, 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 contain, slideshow. These are all, there's a single template that's creating all of these, and it's spec'd out context data that creates all these variants for you. And yeah, so to use this in Drupal, the first thing we have to do is get it to use Twig. This We Are Wondrous, I believe, I think they're based in Switzerland. They've done some great work around this issue. They've created a Twig adapter for Fractal. This isn't really meant to be like a code along with me sort of talk. If you happen to want to mess around, Fractal does provide a CLI that will set itself up for you. You can install the CLI. This will create a new Fractal board. You can CD into that, and it has a little sort of mini node server that will run your Fractal board. But we actually, when we first started this was the process we used to get going, and it was super quick. If you did all that, you would have a very simple setup looking like this. You'd have one sort of example component. You'd have a folder structure with your components, documentation, a large node modules directory, and a place for static images and such. You also end up with a fractal.js file, which is sort of a configuration for Fractal. So I want to talk about the config data part of Fractal. This is still more in how we would sort of change the base setup. It's a config data can be specified in YAML. It can be specified in JSON. You can also use JavaScript files, which we've sort of moved to just because you can write JavaScript to write a loop to generate some code or some data that then gets plopped into context. All you have to do is your example config file that you would get, you can just change it to a JavaScript file, and you're going to module.exports some data. Title is the name of a component, and context is the data we're going to specify for that component. There's also a notion of preview components, which is just another Fractal component, but this is where you sort of define when I'm viewing my component in the Fractal board, this is the thing I want to wrap it with. So maybe jQuery or something is going to come out of Drupal, but in this case, we need jQuery available in Fractal. Any sort of JavaScript builds and your built CSS, you're going to want to include in the preview component. You can have multiples of these, which it's commented out here, but you could name them. This one wraps everything in a color theme. You also have a static path, which is when you're looking at, how you're going to link to your JavaScript or CSS. There's this magical path variable that you can define to anywhere you're going to build your CSS and JavaScript. And when all those paths agree with each other, you have a preview component that uses those paths. You can flip on your preview component. This is straight from that Twig adapter repo. You can, in fractal.js, you're telling it to use Twig. And then you're basically good to go. That was a whole slew. I don't want to get super in the weeds on setup. I would definitely reference that Rachel Andrews article on pattern libraries with Fractal on Smashing Magazine. I sort of mentioned before, Fractal doesn't really care about your CSS. You have to sort of BYO gulp process. Sean is sort of the gulp master over there. We have our gulp build that will start watching our CSS. It'll boot up the Fractal server, and it just renders whatever is the result of your CSS build. So it's kind of, if you want to use CSS, if you want to use Sass, you just put the links in your preview template, and it'll all get there. And that's sort of the setting up portion of Fractal. I don't want to belabor that point, and more just look at how we use it. So we talk about component. A component's kind of any sort of defined chunk, I'll call it, thing. It's, there are sort of standards around maybe like a media object or a tile or a card. It kind of can mean anything you want, as we'll start to see. To build a unique component, you create a directory and you name it whatever the name of your component is, in this case card. You create a config file, and you have your title, which is not actually data, it's just the name of your component. And then within context, you define any of the content that you want your component to use. In this case, we've got a title, an excerpt, a URL, an image. If you notice, I'm using there's an actual image element in a string. We found this is more reusable than sort of like an image source and an alt tag, because Drupal, we're going to rely on Drupal to render an image with sort of maybe it's a media element, there's going to be a template associated with that. This will actually be a render array from Drupal, so for now we're just saying whatever is in there is going to turn into an image. If you went to Sean and Ryan's accessibility talk, you could probably tell me a number of ways that this is not an accessible implementation of a card, but I want to keep it simple. We've spec'd out, any of the data we've defined, we're rendering out, with pretty straightforward Twig. And you get, I don't have any CSS actually running on this. This is just the static HTML at this point. But this would be your card. I talked about this idea of an image. We found it super useful to use any sort of FPO image source that can, gives you a URL that will just generate an image for these rather than having to worry about hosting all your assets. So when you're looking at a component, the idea of variance is an important concept. And we have our initial pass at a card. Maybe some of these things on the right here are variants of a card, where it doesn't have an image, the colors are different. Fractal lets us sort of use a single template to define all these variants. So we've got, this was our original sort of data. We've now got a variance key that is an array of objects that have a name. So this one's going to be the no image one. This one's going to be the dark one, and we've got a unique chunk of data for each of these components. When you do that, and if you haven't, this is just a zoomed in version, Fractal's a little bit weird about falsy values, so if I defined image on this one, these objects kind of get merged into each other, so I have to explicitly say this one doesn't have a URL or doesn't have an image if I want to render it without. And now Fractal will build out these named variants of the initial component. We then have to, after we spec out our data, we can manage, we can handle the variance. So we can do some conditional checks for if we have that image, render it. It's this top section here. The excerpt may not be necessary. The URL may not come in. And this is all pretty straightforward Twig. We might say this isn't actually data, but this is sort of a visual difference. We're just going to add a class on if it's dark, write some CSS to make it the dark version. And I just want to mention a convention we've been playing with where maybe we'll group some of the data that's going to come from Drupal in this data object, while sort of visual styles will stay separate. And then with your CSS, you would have your three variants of a card handled with a single Twig template. So where the CSS goes is a bit of a question. We've explored some different options. Fractal doesn't care, nor does Drupal care. But people will have feelings about it. We've tried a couple places in production code. One is a sort of completely separate Sass build process. And the other is bringing this is sort of, your Fractal components, actually having the Sass file grouped with the Twig file, the config, data, and the Sass right there. To actually use it, so I find this super fun to work with because you have this tight little directory of all the code you need. You have to do a little bit of Sass shenanigans to get the build to work. There's this idea of a Sass glob that will let you do this import. And so this is our sort of the root Sass file that gets built. It's looking in this components directory for all of the component-specific Sass files and building it all out into a single file. That gets imported into your Drupal theme. It gets imported into your Fractal board, and everything agrees with each other. I'm not going to talk, after talking about CSS modules, I'm not going to talk a ton about JavaScript today, but we've talked about the idea of, does the JavaScript file live with the component, or does it live over here in a separate sort of JavaScript build? We're kind of keeping it here, but maybe one day. So we've handled Twig and Fractal. We have, we have the system to build these components that we can sort of modify. We can build variants. We can do whatever we want. We now have to make these usable in Drupal. There's a Drupal module called Component Libraries, and it uses a native sort of Twig piece of functionality that it's called a namespace, and so you can tell Twig that there's going to be a namespace called components, and when it looks at a components sort of namespace, this is where it's going to look. And what that means is, all we did was we installed that module, and this is in your theme.info.yaml file. If you have a component like this, it's set up to take some spec'd out data. It's done all your responsive nonsense. It's rendering out this markup. You can use it directly in a Drupal Twig template like this, where this might be a paragraph template. This is that components namespace that we registered. It's looking off in our sort of the assets sorts components, and we're gonna spit the content right into those spec'd out props that they'll call them in Fractal. The last sort of where does it go question we have to answer is, where do the components go in your sort of Drupal theme? We've done one on the left where the components live kind of within the assets, sort of closer to your Sass files. We've done one where it's a whole separate, kind of lives outside of the rest of the assets. This one lets us do that sort of glob import where we're putting Sass files directly in with the components. I'm sort of on team that. So I want to look a little bit at what this lets us do. If you remember that sort of design with all the different domains, it's very system-based design. It has a lot of these components that have a lot of different variations. This is just one of them where it's a call out, there's some text, there's a link, there's an image. Sometimes it needs a sort of quote treatment. Sometimes it needs an extra description. So we have this notion of themed colors where this green has a light version over there. Sometimes the CMS needs to be able to overwrite the colors with that beautiful combination. And sometimes the image might be full bleed within the component instead of sort of off to the side. This would be an example of the paragraph template for that condensed callout that can implement all of those variations using this sort of fractal. It's weird, it looks like a JavaScript object, but it's like a Twig data structure kind of. We have color theme, we have the actual sort of link, title, description, content. We have, these are Boolean values, so is it the light background, is the image the full width? Clients always want that open link in a new tab sort of handled. And does it get that quote style? So based on, some of these might be fields that you can access in the admin. Some of these might be things that we do some pre-processing based on where the component shows up. And we end up with a super neat and tidy Drupal template that uses a component that is sort of detached from the data that it's actually presenting. It's worth, I just want to point out, the render flags on some of these. I mentioned that Twig is a little weird with falsy values. So at this point, this would be like a Drupal render array. And if it's empty, Twig doesn't see an empty render array as a falsy value. So if we wanted to do a sort of conditional check for, does it have CTA text? If it does, render that text. We need to force the render now so that if there's nothing in there, that is an empty string. When Twig checks it, it's false. It doesn't render. Just another example of, these are a bunch of sort of display paragraph bundles. This would be one called the condensed callout. This is a version of that uses an animated GIF. It also has the ability to maybe override the text in the background color, where this one is just using, I believe, a color theme. So these are two separate paragraph templates using the same Fractal component to render different visual styles of the same component. Does that make sense? How are we doing? We're following a little bit?
Yep.
Yeah.
Any questions at this point? Because I can go back. I'm going to kind of look at some other things. All right, let's keep going. So why is this good? This is referring back to some of those initial designs. When we were looking at this, if you look at these red boxes, we saw a lot of things that were, this is like over 50% of the screen space of this site with this, some sort of header treatment, some sort of description, some sort of button link. There's an image, maybe it's full width, maybe it's a half. There's a couple different type styles. Sometimes the type is centered, sometimes it's towards the bottom. But essentially, this is all the same thing, kind of in different places, in some different iterations. So if you see all the way up at the top here, this is back in our Fractal board. We called it a full width callout. And these are all variants based on that context data of a full width callout. And they're sort of designed to handle, we looked across all the different ways this thing can show up, and we started, looking for maybe there's a really specific one on the portal homepage. Maybe sometimes it's a slideshow, or it's going to rotate through some of those images. Maybe sometimes it's reversed, so the content gets flipped. And we start to build out context data that will let us sort of define what those differences are, and then we write the CSS to handle those variations. It even goes as far as you can embed a YouTube video in there, and it'll load up like the video player. This is a very hardworking component. This is the full width callout paragraph template. We might have some little wrappers around there, but this is sort of a cleaned up version. And this again is this is sort of what I like to think of as the API to this component. So what are the things that Drupal knows this thing can do, and what are the things that this component knows Drupal's going to ask me to do? Some of them are purely visual, so whether it's like type style or does it get a gradient across the image. Sometimes it might be a slideshow, so we pre-process the images, we count them, we know how many there are. Sometimes the image is full left, full right. We've designed this super useful, like reusable component that can do all these styles. And then this is a sort of search of the repo for where we're doing that include of the components. So it's showing up in a block template, it's showing up in some node templates, it's showing up in a few different paragraphs, it's showing up on a taxonomy, I think, at some point. I don't know if it's in there. This one component pulled into all these Drupal templates lets us sort of handle really most of the website. So that's the notion we're trying to get at. We're building separate components, we're pulling them into Drupal templates, and we're designing them to handle all the sort of scenarios they need to. Some of the things we've learned just trying this out, things that will come up. The idea of when a string of text is going to come in from Drupal, is it wrapped in a P tag? Is it not? Does it need to be in an H2 tag? Does it need to be in an H3 tag? Sometimes the component isn't the place to decide that. Sometimes the Drupal template might know a little bit more about where it's going to fall sort of in the site hierarchy. So is it going to, is there an H2 and it should be a child of an H2, so its type needs to be an H3. So we've found ourselves sometimes doing patterns like this where this would be we've got a Drupal template, it's including a link tile, but it knows maybe the link tile doesn't define the sort of header hierarchy. It lets Drupal do that by wrapping the title in H2 and passing that into header. We've also found, and this is more like Chris is a lazy Drupal dev, your life kind of gets easier for things like links if you just let Drupal render them. So dealing with any sort of like admin settings around attributes, putting, just having the URL on the A tag, Drupal kind of sometimes digging in to get that out and get the URL and put it into your component is just a drag. So we'll find ourselves doing some things like if you need to style the link, just wrap it in a div, and then this class knows it's going to get an A, like an anchor tag, A tag. So that's kind of as far as we're going to look at a few more examples, but that's just kind of as far as I want to get into the weeds of looking at Twig and Drupal includes. I want to take a step back and look a little bit at some of the rest of the CSS system that will support these UI components. When I was first kind of looking into this, I came across Jeffrey Zeldman being a little angsty about this idea. This was kind of in reference to a lot of these more sort of like utility class based CSS systems where you're putting font bold as a class on your P tag or something, and you're putting font size big. All these there was back in the day that was like used to be a problem. There was a lot of work done to sort of write more semantic HTML. He's a little bit sort of still arguing for that way. For me, this means a lot. When I first got into this, his book was the first thing I read. To this day, the HTML5 spec says class names should be should not really be visual styles. In practice, that's not really the case all the time, but it's an issue that's going to come up. We like to talk about things, I guess. I went back and looked. Twitter Bootstrap was released in 2011, which I think we felt like we solved semantic HTML, and then we started like, we can make a carousel with 2 class names or something. Let's do that. I think the counter argument to this sort of we must be semantic is that semantic is a flexible word. You can find semantics in visual patterns. This is actually a great post. This guy was a sort of an engineer at Twitter, I believe. We're not going to get too far into that. It's worth mentioning. It might come up. A couple other things that I've found that help me design a system that's going to work out. I just want to look through some ways of thinking about these components. Dan Mall has a great article called Content and Display Patterns. I find myself, every time I go read one of his articles, I've accidentally read like 10 of his articles. But in this article, he describes the notion of a content pattern and a display pattern. Content patterns get into, what is an event? What is an exhibit if you're at a museum? What are the things that have content about them? Display patterns are the sort of more visual treatments. Is it a slideshow? Is it a full-width call-out, as we might call it? For example, this is an event. It's got a sort of an event category. It's got a date. It's got a name. It's got a description. This is more just like a sort of a link to a page on a website. It's got the name of the page and a short description of it. This would be 2 different content patterns, but 1 display pattern. And when it comes to UI components, what we're interested in is the display pattern. So when we look at the reason this is important and the reason it can trip you up is, I think there was a time in my life where that I think felt very familiar, where you're kind of writing classes based on, this is an event, or this is a news item, or this is an exhibit title. These things feel very less reusable than a sort of class name based around the visual treatment of the thing. I can use a split call-out headline on a web page, a page, or an event, but I can't. If I use my event display title class on the title of a news item, that would feel broken. We've seen some examples of this, but it lets us within 2 different templates. This one would be, sort of that featured event. Maybe it's a node template. This is maybe a paragraph template. Both are going to use this sort of idea of the call out. They're going to send whatever data they want. And we can kind of handle that visual pattern from 2 different content types with the same Fractal component. The other sort of notion I want to talk about is this idea of layouts and containers. I think no one had really dealt with that, but it's a sort of way of grouping your CSS so that it cascades nicely, and the things that should overwrite each other do it. It has this idea of objects, which are hard to define, but containers, things you put things in. It's easier to just show and tell. Okay, so this is a pattern that appeared on the site. We've got this big sort of display guy. We've got some sort of tile guys. Over here we've got maybe some different tile things, and maybe there's a header on this one. This one's a carousel. This one's not. But there's a lot of similarity here. Maybe there's one that doesn't even have the featured thing, and these have some text on them. But there's something feeling repetitive here. And maybe it's this. So like there's, and kind of thinking about the idea of a container, we have a sort of layout or a structure that I might throw a headline up there, I might throw a featured thing in there, and then this thing will take any number of things and start to carousel or slider through a bunch of them if there's enough to fill it. Otherwise, it'll just throw them, show what's in there. I feel like this idea needs some repetition. So this is a pattern from a different website. We got some boxes, but if you look at the content sort of in this layout, there's some different colors. There's like a button down there. This, that alignment doesn't really look like that alignment. But maybe this is the thing. Like there's some sort of defined thing that, is going to take whatever you do and make it look like that. So these layouts and containers, these can be used by other Fractal components. But what we've often found is you have a Drupal template that will just spit fields into these that then has another, those fields have a template associated with them to sort of define the look of that content. So, this one, just for simplicity, we kind of got the same sort of link treatment on each side. Maybe there's some different colors. We've got our sort of quick links paragraph template. It's doing a Twig embed instead of an include. And what that lets us do is inside of the toBlock object, we've defined blocks that can be overwritten from the parent template. So whatever, there's a block defined in toBlock object, this is completely overwriting what's in there with just render that field in there. Same thing here. Whatever you've got in there, overwrite it with, this content field. Then these, in this particular case, those fields happen to be paragraphs. They have a template associated with them, and we're using this sort of link group that's going to build our little header and link list. It gets the title, it gets the items, and everything is sort of encapsulated and happy. Does this idea of this sort of layout, containery things, feeling that? And then so we're kind of focusing on these components. There can be a lot of other different ways of writing CSS. You almost don't have to with these components. Like this pattern is just very powerful and flexible. We found we're writing some CSS in some other places, so I'm going to look at some of those. It's sort of unlimited. The atomic design, is that people kind of familiar? Not a little bit. This is that it's inverted triangle CSS where we've sort of these layers of specificity that we're going to overwrite each other with. There are, sort of UI kits. There are utility kits. There are, foundations kind of in the Bootstrap family. What do we do with these when we're trying to combine them with these very sort of packaged up components? If you wanted to, so atomic design is a very sort of specific thing. It tries to divide this idea of components into sort of little components, kind of bigger components, and kind of bigger components. I struggle with that sort of, wherever those two things meet, you're going to be like, does it go in the littler one or the big one? But if you wanted, you could build yourself some atom, molecule, and organism. These are just directories where all the components get nested in those directories. And then you build out your system. These sort of, the idea of, when I'm assembling my components into a template or a page, that's probably going to happen in Drupal templates. This is just kind of showing different ways of putting this together. The rule I've kind of decided that makes my life easy, so I don't have to sit there while I'm trying to write code and be like, is this a molecule? Is this an organism? Everything's in a component. Components can include other components, and looking back to that sort of CSS module example, component styles don't modify children. They choose the variant they want. That's like the sort of amount of rules I kind of like to be comfortable with. I'm going to look at a little example of that. Let's say we've got, this callout group. This thing is probably a variant of maybe the full width callout over there. I find even like naming the things is somewhat arbitrary. We have to be able to talk about them. We need names to look at them, but you end up with like everything is kind of a callout or a card or like a big, blob. The thing we might be tempted to do, looking back at that CSS module example, is if this is the way this component looks, where text is aligned in the middle, if this is like a specific use case of, when it's used in this group, let's just nudge that text down there. So from within the callout group parent, we're going to say when you're the parent of a full width callout, put the text lower in some way. Maybe the text, we're going to tweak the text style a little bit. This is like very, this CSS works. If, nothing bad would happen if you did this. But if the dev that was building the full width, the sort of full width callout component was someone else who was different than the person sort of building this whole structure, this guy doesn't know that maybe this person, is trying to push this text down there. We've lost the place where we're defining the rules about what this thing can do. This is better. So this callout group, in this case, is maybe a Fractal component. There's going to be some stuff above this. There's going to be some, all the sort of articles listed out below it. It's going to pass in the data it needs, and it's going to say, you're the sort of normal instead of type style, or instead of capitalized style. Your text, we've decided, this thing needs the ability to align text to the bottom. Use that style. And rather than, this is like disagreement and sort of lack of awareness about how these components need to work, this is like an agreement. This is, parent component knows what child component can do. I want to cover one more thing. We're kind of getting down to it. Looking at some of those the inverted triangle CSS, maybe the utility styles, what are these useful? What can we do with them? We've kind of actually been using, some variation of this setup. If I had I think the next time I'm kind of starting something, it might look something more like this, where we're setting up tools we need. There's going to be variables. Maybe there's some sort of type style mix-ins. Maybe you've got a sort of CSS grid you want to use. Some people aren't super into that. We're actually even looking at if you need CSS resets these days, like normalize or whatever. It sort of seems like maybe you don't, but we still kind of have them in there. Fractal components live, below. When this is below, this is like literally below in what would be like SAS imports. So these things set up, these things can override these things. And this idea of there's this last level of if I need to, make something hidden or something, maybe I've got like a hidden utility class. I just saw this tweet the other day. It made me laugh. Why? Oh, yeah. So official inverted triangle CSS has this idea of style, like putting styles like default styles on an H2 tag or an H1 tag. And I think we're so, when we're trying to balance accessibility, semantic heading structures and what the designer has made the thing look like, they often, this is not a sort of unrealistic scenario. The whole roll, like I don't know if this is the solution for it, but this is like a thing that comes up a lot. So for us, other than maybe some default form styles, we're essentially no like p tag or h tag or like there's no default styling on those components. They're completely naked. Everything is going to get itself either maybe like a utility class or be defined in a component. Some of these utility layout stuff we're still finding useful. So that's something that maybe lives up in objects. That's when I talk about the grid. That's something that might live up there. Fractal's fractal. This idea of utility styles is one of those table flip emoji sort of conversations. This is actually, I think, one of the best articles about CSS I've ever read, just in terms of like things that made me think in a different way. It's about setting up your own utility. When I say utility style, you might write a class that's like font heading, 1, font heading 2. Maybe you've got 3 or 4 of those, and those are the only things that will ever define what text looks like. And you use these sort of predefined utilities that you've sort of cooked up for yourself to style components. Tailwind, tachyons are sort of these like, you put specific class names on things to define visual styles more so than writing custom CSS for a component. There's sort of a question of do these have room in this type of system? You might be tempted to say maybe we have some basic setups and our components will use them, but they'll override the sort of type styles. So say I've got font heading 1, it's big, it's green, but the sort of alert component might use that utility class, but it'll make the green heading red. Maybe they actually are sort of defined in line with the components. I like them down here where they should be a source of truth. So, let's say I had a class that was like full width call out header, and it was using font heading 1. The component can't override that heading. I'm only going to use that utility class when I know it's true. I've found that's how my mind wants to think about them. The sort of putting up here so the components override them. You can try that. And then this, I've been saying utility class a lot. This is the thing I want to show you, and then we're going to end here, I think. That's real ugly. But if you look at that sort of Cooking with Design Systems article, you will see things like that. What we've got is, BC stands for Bluecadet. I was playing with like name spacing CSS and makes your class names longer. We've got a font treatment and it's a heading 1. We've got some responsive utility styles around how much maybe space needs to live under this heading. This would be at the sort of, from the baseline, there's very little bit. At maybe like a small breakpoint, there's more. It's going to be, the text is black. But because responsive design is a thing, once we reach a certain breakpoint, this type needs to get white. So this, we've, rather than build, give this component a class, that now we have to go into our CSS file and write CSS to make it size like that and space like that and have these colors. We have built ourselves a toolkit before we kind of got into this that lets us do something like this where we almost don't have to write CSS anymore. We build the kit, we can use these utilities, and it feels good. It looks strange. I should have flipped to this slide a second ago, but you can see, we're talking about responsive colors and spacing and type. The thing about this is, like, it really hurts to look at. With components, we can kind of hide it from ourselves. So if it's something that's of interest to you, I think combining it with some sort of like component abstraction like this is actually pretty nice, because once I'm in maybe a parent component or in Drupal template land, I never have to see that again. It just works and is happy, and maybe like my CSS is probably lighter weight. And even if you're using it within another, within the component itself, all this thing is going to do is render an image and render this heading. This kind of is more sort of React world. Like, this wouldn't be weird to do in a React sort of app where I have a component that all it does is render an H2 tag, but I've completely like abstracted away this nonsense so that when I use it, it's just, oh, it's a banner heading. It knows what it wants to do. Yeah, so to me, I think the team is a little about this. I don't know that I would do it again, but it's like a sort of, I want to see what that tastes like. It's a nice experiment. So that was kind of a lot. I'm going to end on this slide. When it comes to sort of designing a component library, Brad Frost talks about, this is a quick little article and a sort of tool for assessing a design. You look at, what are all the call-outs in the designs maybe you got? What are all the nav systems? Like, you just pull them into a PowerPoint or like a Keynote thing. What are all, designers are sometimes super consistent, sometimes not. Having everything just like literally in one place lets you have a conversation about, what is it that you actually need to build, so that you can, when you're in Fractal world, all of this can kind of be handled with, some color themes and some variants. And yeah, I think I'm going to stop there. I'm happy to take some questions. Thanks for bearing with me on that one.
I'm curious. I worked on some stuff like Pattern Lab, which is similar, and just tying it into Drupal is a massive amount of work. I'm not sure if that's. I don't know. Did you guys do the Drupal first or this first? I feel like if we did the Drupal last, it would have been a whole different story with this.
Were you kind of simultaneously?
A design company did the Pattern Lab initially, and we worked on the Drupal, and then we had to tie it in together, and we ended up having to like almost completely redo the Pattern Lab side, which is the equivalent of the Fractal side.
Yeah, so I think the thing for me is, if I'm trying to think about Drupal data and write CSS at the same time, my brain hurts. So I wanna like look at the design comps and kind of know everything it's gonna have to do. As we've been doing this, we've kind of done it on 3 sites now. This got pretty far along, the sort of system and the components, but then we might say, like maybe this thing is conditional and we didn't know, or maybe it needs to, like a multi-value field is going to come in here as opposed to just, a text string. So being flexible in the Fractal side and adapting it to what you've discovered is going to come in there, and doing that all with the same team does help, as opposed to like a consultant that delivers you this sort of pattern library. Because the actual, like the getting it in Drupal, some of these, when you're doing this in a Drupal template, I'm way happier to do that than try to like map class names onto, these render arrays or something. It's how I've been feeling. Anyone else in the back?
When you end up with that multiplicity of buttons, do you ever find that's an opportunity to have a conversation with the designer and say, did you really need this many variations of this thing?
Yeah, and that's what, it really is it's a cool document, and it is, to me, it is a place, like, we definitely killed this one, so like, well, circles don't exist in this system. I think, like, this was one that was offset from things, but nothing else was doing that, so there was, like, refinements that we made this doc had some conversations. I think, some of those colors maybe went away. There's probably some like 3 or 4 different font weights in that one. There's one, these were all type styles across the thing, and it's like maybe, for performance reasons, we could kill a couple of font weights. It's definitely like a place to have a conversation.
So how far these components can be reused for any of your other projects?
Yeah, okay, so I stopped early. The last slide, within Bluecadet, our team is called the sauce team. There's the sauce pot where we write shared code. It's a whole thing. We've found that we've been doing a lot of work on accessibility, and just like the fact that we have a place that like just making that card layout like kind of more accessible is like something I don't want to hold in my brain all the time, or like finally figuring out like we know this is an accessible modal, putting that pattern somewhere that has like there's a few variants, and it's got the Sass file, it's got a Twig file, and it can just be plopped into a project that's going to build out in the same, build Sass in the same way. It's really great, and it's great for sort of like, this is there's a Git repo that manages this, so we can sort of, chat about some of these things as they're in development. I don't know that we're using it, but Fractal, like, there's these little circles in here. They let you mark, like, this is in the works, this is done, it can be used in production. So it has some features around that. Yeah. Do you have anything, Poche?
Yeah. We all know that like Drupal is really opinionated, and there are also like times where like you can't easily map a Fractal component or like a pattern lab component into a Drupal template, so Twig file. I just want to get a sense of like how do you actually deal with that situation where you have to manage like maybe potentially 2 markups, one in like the component library and one in your preprocessed function or like custom class that you're building in Drupal.
So I think it's come up in a few places. This isn't a great analogy, but the container thing is maybe a good example where, should I go past it? Maybe I did. Like if you think about the site, like the header of a website or the footer, it's kind of got this structure, and it's going to plop, like blocks are going to get rendered into it. Everything ends up in a Twig block, and it ends up getting overwritten by a Drupal field or something, or block.
But what if you're in a situation where you can have a theme hook suggestion for this particular field that you're trying to theme, and you need to add in markup into your preprocess function within Drupal?
We've honestly, we other than menus, we're kind of leaning on this sort of Drupal menu template that builds out like a nested sort of UL structure for you. We really don't. We haven't come across a thing that was really impossible. Maybe like trying to get an SVG icon into an anchor link is kind of why we did that sort of wrapping structure of like, well, let's wrap it with a div. The SVG goes in that div. The A tag goes in there. We do some funky spacing, and then we don't have to pre-process that markup. Yeah.
Cool.
I mean, like honestly, like Pete, I don't know if you can think of or any of you.
I used the thing that I was thinking of when you said it. Pretty much everything we force it.
Blocks a lot to replace it.
Yeah, we do use blocks a lot to take care of some of that stuff. The Fractal component looks really nice, and then Drupal adds all its crap around it. So that's what the blocks, I guess, are the biggest way.
Right.
On that.
Yeah, because sometimes you don't have control over those markups you need in order for Drupal to render things perfect.
We also run into like all the quick edit stuff, like we have all turned off, so we're not caring about that markup anyways.
Right.
And we go to turn it back on, and nothing works. So we're not doing that.
Oh yeah, I do like the contextual region. I've been like position absoluting that to fill whatever space it's in, so it doesn't like push your images around.
Right.
Did you have a question?
I was just going to say, what we ended up doing a lot is just copying the HTML from Drupal into Pattern Lab, and then just writing CSS for it. So
that's the thing that I feel like if you have to do that, then it's broken.
it's
Yeah.
such a pain in the ass to do it the right way sometimes with like menus that show up differently. And
Yeah.
Menus is the only thing that we did actually the opposite way. They built them in front component, and we would take pretty much class names. We would do class names throw that all back into menu templates because Drupal's menu template is pretty complex and it's got to do all its thing. That's the only thing where I was just like, screw it,
Like sometimes you have to perform your markup.
yeah,
work with
it's
Drupal,
just
yeah.
it was too much of an hassle. Basic entities and everything we've been able to make it force it to work.
Cool. If this is, got to do there's a lot of slides in this deck. Hang on. Wait for it. Wait for it. Oh, man. Sorry. We're hiring for Drupal devs at Bluecadet. If this is of interest to you, designing these systems, we would love to have you. Here we go.
Yeah. Good call.